Hello, everyone. We hope you all had fun virtually camping with us yesterday. Thank you for joining us again today for the second day of our 3-day third-party risk management bootcamp. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars or did not join us yesterday, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of that widget. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Ask Question widget. We love getting questions and do capture all of them throughout the session, and we'll be answering some during the live webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. In the Related Content widget, you will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our resources library, which has thousands of educational resources, and links to several specific resources that we feel will be helpful. You'll also notice underneath the slide area and next to the Related Content widget is a graphic showing the third-party risk management lifecycle. This will be helpful to reference throughout today's sessions to understand at what point these topics fit into the overall third-party risk management process. Today's live session is eligible for up to 2 CPE credits, 1 per hour. If you wish to receive these credits, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during each session's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the bootcamp has concluded on Friday, April 19th, that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. We hope you found day 1 of the bootcamp valuable. We covered the difference between criticality and risk ratings, steps to implement a risk-based vendor due diligence strategy, critical vendor contracts, and an overview of fourth and nth parties. Today, we're going to cover vendor cybersecurity posture, vendor business continuity and disaster recovery as part of your cybersecurity program, assessing vendor SOC reports, and last, managing AI risk with third-party risk management. For the next hour, we will be joined by VendMinder's Information Security Operations Director, Lisa May Hill, who will discuss your vendor cybersecurity posture and vendor business continuity and disaster recovery as part of your cybersecurity program. At 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Lisa May will be back to talk about vendor SOC reports and reviewing findings and next steps. After that, Hillary Dewhurst, VendMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, will join us to discuss how to manage AI risk with third-party risk management. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Lisa. Lisa, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. Welcome to Knowing Your Vendor's Cybersecurity Posture to Protect Your Organization. My name is Lisa May Hill, and today we're going to be talking about vendor cybersecurity posture, what to review from your vendors, data breaches, and we'll talk about some statistics that are out there right now, tips and best practices, and then of course we'll circle back with key takeaways. Okay, let's jump right in. Okay, so when we talk about your vendor's cybersecurity posture, what does that mean? I mean, ultimately, we want to figure out, is your vendor prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to a cybersecurity issue or event? We know that we're investing in our own cybersecurity programs, but we don't often invest in ensuring that our vendors are doing the same thing. And we do this through third-party risk management. But understanding what to look for, who should look at it, and when to look at it is critical, right? So we want to make sure that we're following that CIA information security triad, which we'll talk about in a second. But then we also want to make sure that you understand what it is that you're looking for. You want to be qualified to be looking for the right things, right? You want to be the right person looking at the right stuff. And that's what we're going to talk about. So a lot of people ask, what exactly is cybersecurity, right? Like, what does that mean? What's the difference between cyber and InfoSec and all these different terms? Excuse me. But ultimately, cybersecurity is based on the CIA information security triad. It's the foundation of cybersecurity, really. And what that is C stands for confidentiality, which is preventing the unauthorized disclosure of information. To guarantee confidentiality under the CIA triad, vendor communication channels and media have to be properly monitored and controlled to prevent unauthorized access. Things like principle of least privilege, separation of duties, these are the kinds of things that can start you down that right path towards confidentiality. The I stands for integrity. This means that you're ensuring that data is not modified by unauthorized means. And to guarantee integrity, vendors have to be able to demonstrate that they have controls in place to protect information from unauthorized modification. And one way to do that is, proper input, processing, and output controls. And then the A stands for availability. And this is ensuring that information is available when it's needed and only to those authorized to have it. Vendors should be able to validate how they prevent and handle any downtime, interruptions, and you really want to make sure that all three pieces are together to create that solid cybersecurity, information security triad. I don't think we have to spend a ton of time on why it's important. I think we all understand the risk if we don't take cybersecurity seriously, especially with our third parties. It's a hot button issue for regulators. It is always going to be. But I think on the other side too, understanding cybersecurity and understanding what controls are important is also a really great way to influence your vendors to strengthen their controls. It also allows you to supplement their controls with your own, right? So you guys can have that marriage of security. And then ultimately, understanding cybersecurity and what your vendor is doing should factor into the decision-making process of whether you want to stay with them or not. I think the old adage is right. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Our industry best practice and regulatory guidance wants you to consider all the potential ramifications posed by a third party, whether that's in the form of a data breach or a disruption or an incident. So from a planning standpoint, you need to consider all of the possible problems that could occur, what steps you need to be prepared for to take, and how long until normal operations can resume in order to really minimize the impact to your organization and your customers of any issue that comes up. So ultimately, you really do need to make sure that you are concentrating on those vendors with the same level of due diligence that you concentrate on your own cybersecurity. Okay, so the next, kind of part of this webinar is talking about what to review, our 4 critical elements. We are going to whip through this section because truly we could talk about each one of these next several slides on their own in its own presentation. So feel free to ask, send out any questions at the end. We have lots of material on these topics and certainly future webinars that talk about these more in depth. But we are going to kind of go through these relatively quickly. So when we're talking about what to review, we want to look at security testing, sensitive data security, employee, contractor, and vendor management, and then, of course, incident detection and response, and a little cybersecurity insurance coverage. So let's jump right in. So starting with security testing, this is a great way to identify weakness or the prevention of weakness in a tangible format. Your vendor's reported security testing should include things like evidence that they're being performed regularly, that it's standardized penetration testing, that they're doing internal and external networks, and that they're also doing things like application security testing and social engineering testing. Social engineering testing should include things like simulated phishing emails and employee awareness tests. Regular security testing should also come with some documented follow-up to let you know that any findings were resolved. And that they have a process and plan in place for when findings come up, and so that they can demonstrate that they're identifying issues, solving those issues, or resolving those issues, and then putting mitigations in place to prevent them moving forward. Next is sensitive data security. This means how does your vendor protect data from destructive forces and from unwanted actions of authorized users, right? This is where we're talking about integrity. Understanding how vendors secure your data at rest and in transit is monumental. They should have controls in place like encryption, data retention and destruction policies, data classification and privacy policies, access management. This is all just part of securing that sensitive data. You want to make sure that they're securing it from unauthorized users, like data breaches, theft, that kind of thing. And it's important to look at this at the policy level and at the procedure level. Next up, we want to talk about how the vendor manages their employees, their contractors, and then their vendors, or your fourth parties. With employee, contractor, and vendor management, you have to understand the vendor's ability to ensure that their agents are prepared to protect your data. Training of these groups, as well as documented and enforced access management, are so important. Things like confidentiality agreements, security training. This is where that social engineering testing comes back in as well. Is it paired with training? How do they manage their vendors, and how do they manage vendor access? These are just some of the ways that your third party can kind of offer you assurance that anyone with access to your data is properly trained. So it's not just about what they say they do. You want to make sure that that trickles down to their employees, their contractors, their third parties, etc. So you want to make sure that they have a robust third-party management program just like you. So the final element is really incident detection and response, and of course, cybersecurity insurance coverage. You want to understand that an incident is anything that affects the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information or an information system. So your vendors need to have a plan to address incidents quickly and effectively, because it will undoubtedly happen. And then, you want to make sure that the cyber insurance that they have makes sense, right? A cybersecurity insurance does not replace security, and we have to be really careful to understand that it is not a substitute for security. But what it does do is kind of ensures that your vendor is taking cybersecurity seriously, but you want to make sure they have the right plans, errors and omissions for cybersecurity, a true cybersecurity insurance plan, not just a general liability. So understanding those pieces, I think, are important. So when we're talking about reviewing these critical elements, ultimately the question always comes up, well, what documents do I need? And really, you need a handful of different things. So from a legal and procedural aspect, you're looking for things like confidentiality agreements, mutual non-disclosure agreements, employee background checks, contractor background checks. Do they perform security awareness training? Do they validate that training? What's their cybersecurity insurance? So when you're talking about what do I need to ask for, this is a great first start when we're talking about legal documents, and then we'll get into a couple of other things as well. Some specific policy documents that you can request are, do they have an information security policy? Does it include an access management policy? How do they cover mobile devices? Do they have a bring your own mobile device policy? Of course, encryption, we talked about that. What's their privacy policy? And not just their consumer-facing privacy policy, but what's their internal privacy policy? And then, of course, data management. What do those policies look like? Are they all included in their cybersecurity or information security policy? These are just some suggestions, but this is a great start. And finally, when we're talking about documentation, planning documents is really the last piece. These documents should reveal the details of how a vendor handles certain scenarios. Things like their third-party vendor risk management. Do they have a program in place for that? What does it look like? What do they do? And then their incident management and incident response. Those two things go hand in hand, but you want to see them separately. You want to see that they have a dedicated response policy or procedure in place. And things like business continuity and disaster recovery, incident management, security management, you want to make sure all those include the testing results. And this will just kind of give you some more insight into their policies and procedures at a planning level.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first question is, do you include data breach notification requirements in your vendor contracts? Yes, no, somewhat, or not sure. Lisa, we have some time now to answer a question from the audience. And that question is, how much cyber insurance is enough on a vendor?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, there really isn't one specific answer for this. It's going to vary. For example, if your vendor is a healthcare-related company or is covered under HIPAA, or really any industry that levies hefty fines for data breaches, then their financial risk is going to be much higher. I think I've heard that $1 million per occurrence is a pretty standard policy for a small business. But of course, those large vendors, you would expect significantly more. It's really important, though, to ensure certain types of coverages are in place versus amounts. You want to make sure that they have cyber-specific coverages. You want to check for more coverages that are more aligned with errors and omissions for cyber. As many of the general policies that we see a lot of, they specifically carve out cyber incidents because there is a level of expectations that you'll have a separate cyber liability policy. And it's also important to really understand that insurance is not a substitute for actual security or data protection controls. Insurance is reactive, but it does demonstrate a certain level of confidence that cybersecurity is taken seriously. So you want to look at it as a piece of the puzzle. You certainly don't want it to be the only thing that a vendor has as a protection in place.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Back to you, Lisa.
Okay, so jumping back in, we're going to talk about data breaches, everybody's favorite topic. I think it goes without saying data breaches are on the rise. I don't see a future where they're not. Anybody is at risk. Hackers don't discriminate based on industry or size of your business. It really isn't so much a if an organization will have an incident, but when. So what we want to do is just kind of talk about what you can do to prevent that. So this slide is really just informational to kind of demonstrate how big breaches are getting. It's only the first quarter of the year, and we're already at 30 million records that have been breached so far. Ultimately, I think it's just important that we understand that it's only going to continue, right? So we know that breaches impact organizations regardless of size, and we know that industry-wise, healthcare, education, and of course the public sector are the most impacted. So it really just kind of draws our attention to how important it is that we continue to put cybersecurity on the forefront, both internally at our own organizations, but also at our vendors. We need to make sure that we're all doing the right stuff. So this website listed on the bottom, the source of these statistics, is a great website to check out. Lots of really interesting information on there. So encourage everyone to head over to that site if they have time to take a look. So we're going to talk about each of these in more detail on the next few slides. But we really want to make sure that when we're talking about breaches, we're talking about it from 2 lenses, right? What we want our vendors to do and what to do if there's a breach on our vendor, and then what we want to do in-house. What can we do to be more preventative, but also how we want to react and what we want to do internally to be in a better position if a breach happens. And so we'll talk about each of these points in the next few slides. So let's talk about these pieces a little bit more in depth. Number 1, we just talked about be transparent. That's really going to be your first step. And, making sure that this stuff is done proactively is so critical. Breach notification requirements in your contract language, I can't say that enough. Many people don't have them. They don't even know what the breach notification process is for their vendors. You want to have a say in that, and so you want to define that up front. And then you want to make sure that you have a notification process as well for your requirements, the state AG, law enforcement, regulators, whatever you are beholden to. And then, of course, defining that impact of the breach. Again, trying to do that as soon as possible is so important. You want to understand what you're dealing with. Was the breach isolated to one individual? Did it impact a lot of customers? Did it impact none of your customers, just your client data? And then you want to have your customer notification process because, again, it's so important that you're the one notifying your impacted customers directly. You don't want them to get it secondhand or third hand from either the news or your third party, which they may not even understand that impacts them. And then, you can always offer credit monitoring services. Ultimately, a data breach which has non-public personal information or PII or NPPI or health information or anything of a sensitive nature increases your individual's risk of identity theft. So this is a great way to help protect your customers, but also, a sign of good faith. Another great best practice is implementing more robust user authentication procedures to your systems. This is definitely should be done if customers have access to online tools. Buckle down internally. And then, of course, perform root cause analysis, right? There's that deep audit testing again. You want to enhance your security controls. Lightning can strike twice. So you want to learn from every breach and build a stronger information security system internally as well as with your vendor. And then, these last two are kind of when the dust settles, right? And we talk about deep audit testing in the slide before, but really making sure that you understand the impact if your vendor is not willing to cooperate. So you want to set expectations with your vendors. You want to make sure that if they do have an incident or a breach, that you're able to then audit them, test them, make sure that it's, limit the risk of it happening again. And then you also want to do an internal assessment, right? You want to look and reflect internally on your overall information security process and make sure that you're documenting any updates and implement refresher training for all employees. Like everything, it starts in-house, right? So we want to worry about our vendors, but we also want to make sure that we're learning from any issues that they had and then seeing where we can do better internally as well. And so I know I've mentioned this a couple of times already, but this idea of being proactive and putting protections into your vendor contracts is really important. And I think in the past, we have allowed ourselves to be reactive to issues, right? And I think we've learned that that has not done well, especially when we're talking about third-party risk management. And I think our regulators are saying, no way. I need you to be proactive. So here are some protections that you can start putting inside of your vendor contracts. Things like accessibility to the vendor's cyber policies and procedures. I cannot emphasize this enough. We all know how hard it is to get information from our vendors, and vendors all know how hard it is to disclose information to their clients, right? They're getting asked from a million directions. So understanding what you need ahead of time and defining that in your contract is going to help you and them. It's going to help your relationship be stronger if you're asking and notifying up front. The right to audit is just so important. And being clear and knowledgeable about what you want. That way the vendor can give you exactly what you need and not have a lot of back and forth. You want to define independent testing requirements. Is there certain things that you want to see that they aren't currently doing? Can you define that so that they can add that in or explain why they don't? Frequency and availability of test results, right? You want to let them know that you want that information. Recovery times, backup responsibilities, what's their cyber resiliency, Management of third-party outsourced business continuity. What do they do with their third-party plans? And then, of course, your breach and disruption notification. And I just do think that doing this as proactively as possible is the way to build that relationship with your vendor, because it helps you, but it also helps them. Okay, so last but not least, wrap it up all together for a couple of key takeaways. First and foremost, include right to audit language in your contracts. Again, that proactive method is truly the best way to get what you need. Only share sensitive data when necessary. Can't emphasize that enough. We should only be allowing vendors access to what they need to access. Ask for everything you need up front. Make sure you know who to review and when. So, determining which vendors you want to start with, which are the most critical, which are the most high risk, and then ensure you have the right people doing the review, right? We want to make sure that we are understanding what we're looking for and that we're using the right people to do that. And then what are you trying to protect, right? Understand what data you're trying to protect. Always include breach notification language in your contracts so that you can have notification as soon as possible, and be prepared with your own breach notification plan, right? Be prepared to handle your own breaches. And then finally, again, be as proactive as you can, but be ready to be reactive, right? So you want to do as much as you can up front, but know that you might also have to react, and be prepared for both.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa, for that informative session. Lisa will now discuss vendor business continuity and disaster recovery as part of your cybersecurity program. You can refer to the full life cycle that is below the slides area on your screen to understand where this fits into the third-party risk management process. Lisa, back to you.
Okay, so in this session, we are going to talk about the link between cybersecurity and business continuity. So we're going to go over business continuity and disaster recovery plans. We'll talk a little bit about what to look for in these plans, what to review in these plans, kind of those key takeaways. And then we're going to talk about incorporating cybersecurity into business continuity management, because as we know, everything in this space is really truly linked together. All right, so let's just jump right in. Okay, so what exactly is business continuity management? Well, BCM is really an umbrella term that encompasses business continuity, disaster recovery, things like pandemic planning, crisis management. It really incorporates proactive measures to mitigate disruptive events, and then also evaluates an organization's recovery capabilities. It's all linked back to availability. So BCM provides direct insight into how availability is protected and ensured, both internally at your organization, but also when we're talking about our vendors. So business continuity management is going to allow for you and your vendors to proactively plan for disasters and interruptions. And it also allows you to provide assurance to your customers that your product and service will always be available. And when we're talking about the management of business continuity, we're saying that it's going to help protect your organization from data loss as well. This all feeds back into that availability piece of the cybersecurity information security triad that we talked about earlier. Okay, so I get asked a lot, are business continuity and disaster recovery the same thing? What are they? And the answer is no, they are not the same. They work hand in hand, they should be together, but they are not the same. Business continuity really allows you to ensure that key operations, products, and services continue to be delivered either in full or at a predetermined and accepted level of availability. Disaster recovery is a subset of that, right? Disaster recovery should really be outlining the process and procedures that are followed at the immediate onset of a disruption or incident, up to and including the resumption of normal operations. So we do this for our own internal organizations, just like we talked about in the last session, right? Our cybersecurity we do for ourselves, But it's important to understand what your vendor is doing, especially when we're talking about availability for with these vendors that have a critical part of our service offerings. So on this slide, we have a little bit of terminology that you're going to hear a lot throughout this presentation. So we're just going to go over it really quick. We're going to talk a bit about business impact analysis. And this is really used to determine the impact on the organization of the loss of a specific business function or service within a line of business. So truly, what is the business impact? And you're analyzing that to get that information. Recovery time objective, RTO, this helps identify the targeted duration of time which the vendor must restore a business process post-disruption to avoid an unacceptable consequence associated with business continuity. So simply put, it's the maximum acceptable time that an application or computer or network or system can be down after an unexpected incident or disaster. The RPO, which is recovery point objective, is the interval of time that would pass during a disruption before the quantity of data loss during that period exceeds a predetermined maximum allowable threshold or tolerance. That is a mouthful. Put a little bit more simply, it really just determines how far back into the data's history you need to go for backup storage to resume normal operations. And then MTD, or maximum tolerable downtime, specifies the maximum period of time that the vendor can be down before the disruption in services can cause a significant or material loss. So it's what your tolerance is. What's your max tolerable downtime before major issues occur? And we'll talk about these throughout the next few slides. So when we talk about a business impact analysis, we're talking about this in two different contexts, right? We're talking about our own business impact analysis, like what does it mean to us to do one? And then we also want to make sure our vendors are doing them. So when we're talking about our own, we want to ask ourselves, would a sudden loss of this vendor cause a material disruption to my organization? Because ultimately the BIA is used to determine if your organization can operate effectively if this vendor is unavailable. So would that sudden loss of this vendor impact our customers? Would the time to recover operations exceed 24 hours? Or would there be a negative impact to your organization? What does that look like? So you really, when you're doing it internally, you want to ask yourself, what is the business impact, right? And then that helps you evaluate every other piece. So trying to understand why a BIA is important. If your BIA shows that your organization can't operate effectively while a vendor is unavailable, then your third-party risk management program needs to include thoroughly evaluating the vendor's business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans, as well as their BIA. Understand the procedures they have in place to handle a business impacting event. You want to be aware of possible downtimes that could affect your operations or your reputation, and then you want to plan accordingly with your own BC and DR plans. So your BIA should really include things like critical business functions, such as support activities, systems, the interrelationships that can be analyzed in several ways, workflows, interviews, organizational charts, network diagrams, topologies, data flow diagrams, things like succession planning. How is authority delegated for key personnel? This is really important when we're talking about identifying business processes and hierarchies. And then, of course, management really should conduct an interdependency analysis, which would help identify single points of failure in close geographic proximity. So just understanding how the businesses are linked, products and services, really want to make sure that you can see everything from a big picture. When we talk about the risks to availability and business continuity, I want you to think of ICE, I-C-E. I stands for identify your vendors and their product or service. This can include fourth and end party as well. So I is for identify. C, characterize. Characterize your vendors. Who are your critical vendors? Do they source outside themselves to service you? you want to make sure that you understand what bucket they fall into outside of just criticality. So C is characterize. And then E is evaluate. Evaluate your vendor's business continuity posture and their response to disruptions. So when we talk about that, what we're really saying is you want to make sure that you don't only understand your response to a disruption, but how does your vendor respond? And you want to make sure that that becomes part of your due diligence. So E is for evaluate, I-C-E. Okay, and I think we're actually going to turn it over for a poll question.
Our second poll question of the day is, do you have established RTO and RPO requirements for your vendors? Yes, no, or not sure? Lisa, I have another question here that we can answer. And this question is, what is a sufficient RTO or RPO for my vendor to guarantee?
So that's a tough one. The answer really depends. The thing about recovery point and time objectives is that you need to understand what your needs as the client are and make sure it aligns with the vendor's capabilities. This is something I would recommend be discussed as early on as possible so that you can align your expectations with the vendor. And when we're talking about RTO and RPO, you want to also consider what your maximum allowable downtime is to meet your service commitments, and make sure that any vendors that play a role in that service offering are aligned. When you outsource these pieces of your business, you have to understand the connection of that piece to your service offering and make sure that any impact to your RTO and RPOs that you guarantee are taken into account. So unfortunately, it's not something that you can just have a generalized answer for. It's really specific to your relationship and what that vendor provides to you and how that relates to what you then provide to your customer base. The only thing I can tell you is to make sure you're having those discussions as early on as possible, because you don't want to be rehashing them after something happens and they can't meet an RTO or RPO that you need them to.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our vendor cybersecurity elements to include in Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Plans ebook within the related content widget. This is a handy resource. Lisa, back to you.
Okay, so jumping back in, when we talked about cybersecurity in the previous session and now with BCR and DR plans, it's important to understand that cybersecurity and business continuity management are intricately linked because IT networks and systems are essential to your business continuity. They have to work together to protect data and streamline responses to any disruption. So in today's landscape, when we're talking about cyber attacks, they remain a serious threat. It's critical to have measures in place to protect your organization from risk, including third-party data breaches. So really, when we talk about incorporating cybersecurity into business continuity and disaster recovery, what we're saying is that business continuity and disaster recovery plans should include appropriate cyber and InfoSec measures that are practiced and integrated to enable a seamless recovery from a disruption. Cybersecurity disruptions should be incorporated into business continuity and disaster recovery because you want to put an emphasis on protection, prevention, recovery, and threat detection. So like any business disrupting event, a cybersecurity incident can have detrimental effects on your organization's financial health, reputation, customers. So your policies need to be coordinated effectively. You know, we say it all the time, but it's only a matter of time before there is some type of breach or incident, whether it's to you or to your vendors. So you want to prepare for that worst case and have plans that outline how your business will continue operations, and they need to work together. With the next several slides, we're going to talk about best practices for incorporating cybersecurity into business continuity management. So we're going to talk about taking a proactive approach. Again, there's that word proactive. Reviewing your vendor's breach notification policy and ensure it's detailed in the business continuity and disaster recovery plans. Ensuring RTOs related to a cyber attack are included in your business continuity and disaster recovery plans. And knowing what your vendor's RTOs are. Back up your data and define your RPOs and perform ongoing monitoring. Okay, so number one is taking that proactive approach. When dealing with disruptions, your approach can't be solely reactive. You want to consider some cybersecurity measures and steps in the business continuity management program, and things like determining who will be responsible for specific actions, limiting access to private information to relevant stakeholders and privileged vendor accounts, ensuring that there are cybersecurity provisions in your contract and the SLAs require your vendor to maintain effective BCDR plans, incorporating those vendor due diligence reviews, inventorying the data and services that your vendor controls. You'll see some repetition from the previous session because these practices are intricately linked. So number two, review your vendor's breach notification policy and ensure it's detailed in the BCDR plans. Now in the previous section, we talked about having that breach notification policy up front in your contract. And that's still true. You do want it at the contract phase. But you also want to make sure that they have a breach notification process that correlates with that notification time period, right? And you want to make sure that that's in their BCDR plan because it's important that they know who and when to communicate what to. And usually the business continuity disaster recovery team will reference those policy documents, those procedure documents to make sure that they're doing the right thing. So you want to make sure it matches. If you're contractually agreed to a certain set time and their policies and procedures don't match that, you want to make sure that that is documented somewhere for them so that their team knows how to proceed. Make sure the RTOs related to a cyber attack are included in that BCDR plan. And you want to make sure that you know what those RTOs are. A recovery time objective. How long will it take your organization or your vendor to resume normal operations? Does it meet the contractual obligations? Does it make sense? Does it work for what you've promised your clients and customers? So number four is backing up data and defining your RPOs. So we said earlier that an RPO, simplistically put, determines how far back into the data's history you need to go for backup storage to resume normal operations, right? So when it comes to managing your data, you can't rely on a single network. It's necessary to back up data on a regular basis. This can be hourly, daily, weekly. You want to have a consistent backup plan, and generally, best practice is daily or nightly backups. To recover your operations, it's really good to have offline backup of your data, right? So something that's completely away from your production system. Backing up your data gives you a peace of mind in case of an attack or an interruption of service. And so making sure that you define those RPOs so that you know exactly how to set backups and how you expect your vendors to set up backups is critical. Backups should also be encrypted at rest and in transit. The details around how your organization and vendors will accomplish this should be included in the BC and DR plans. Backing up your data and determining your RPO, which again is the amount of data loss that's acceptable, how far back to do your backups. It's important because in a disruption, you want to make sure that you have a threshold of how much data your organization can afford to lose in the case of any type of attack or disruption. RPO is just such an important part of business continuity and disaster recovery plans and is also often paired with the RTO, which is the recovery time objective, as well as the maximum tolerable downtime. So those numbers, those thresholds all are intertwined. And your RPO will be dependent on your organization's workload and loss tolerance. And that's all part of doing that business impact analysis and developing those business continuity plans. And once you've established what they are for your own internal business, then you can turn and look at your vendors to see if they are comparable, if they meet your expectations, and if your plans will work together. And finally, performing ongoing monitoring. Monitoring your vendor's performance throughout the relationship is essential, as is determining if there are any hidden risks and finding ways to mitigate these risks. As new systems and networks evolve, it's important to check for changes. This goes for all monitoring, right? But understanding if there's changes in how your data is being accessed, used, processed. Are there changes in cybersecurity guidelines or disaster recovery guidelines that could affect your organization's security, or breach notifications? Looking for red flags that may need to be addressed. Business continuity and disaster recovery, like cybersecurity, are not one-and-done activities. So you want to make sure that you have a plan for regular reviews of their business continuity and disaster recovery.
Our next poll question is, do you regularly review your vendors' BC or DR plans? Yes, no, or not sure? Lisa, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience while we wait for those results. And this question is, what if my third party isn't willing to share their disaster testing?
This is another great question, and frankly, it comes up in probably every single webinar that I've done in one way or another. Ultimately, it's really common for a vendor to not want to share documents, period, especially though testing results. And we see this a lot in cyber as well with penetration testing and application security testing. And really, my response is always the same in that it doesn't really matter if they're not willing to share the actual test results. That's okay. Test results are generally very sensitive information that can allow you insight into areas that you weren't really required to see for your due diligence. But what you do want to see is validation that testing is done. You want to see when it was done and whether or not there's a policy or procedures in place to correct any deficiencies or medium and high risk findings that were identified during the test. So you want to verify what was done, when it was done, and that the results were reviewed and followed up on. If your vendor isn't willing to share that basic level of detail, then I think further discussion is warranted, because really all you're looking to see is that they're doing their due diligence as it applies to the availability of their product or service. And that's a fair ask, in my opinion. And I think it's something that you generally should be looking for.
And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. Also, just a quick reminder to head over to the related content widget to grab our What Vendor Documents Are Needed to Assess Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery infographic. Lisa, let's continue with the presentation.
Okay, so to kind of wrap up this session, we want to talk about just a couple key takeaways. The first being that you want to make sure you're reviewing your vendors' business continuity and disaster recovery plans regularly. We want to make sure that as we're doing our annual due diligence that we're including BC and DR, especially for those critical vendors where availability is a primary concern. And that's number two, and ensure you're evaluating availability when deciding who and what to review, right? And if we go back to the previous session, we talked about how availability is ensuring that information is available when it's needed and only to those authorized to have it. So vendors need to be able to validate how they prevent and handle downtime and interruptions, and that's a big key of business continuity and disaster recovery, which is why cybersecurity and BCR go in hand. You want to make sure you're reviewing your vendor's BIA as well as your own. That business impact analysis on both sides is so important. And ensure that you have documented and discussed your breach notification expectations. You want this at the contract level, but you also want to see their process outlined in their business continuity and disaster recovery documentation. And then, of course, finally, it's not a one-and-done process. Business continuity and disaster recovery should be ongoing. You want to make sure that it just becomes part of your process. And again, especially for those vendors that we're talking about availability.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that session. Before we move on to our next session, where Lisa will discuss vendor stock reports, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. Please meet us back right here in 10 minutes. You do not need to close out and log back in, just simply leave everything as is. We do recommend refreshing your connection at the top of the hour to stay on track with the session. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We are now going to move on to our next session, which is Assessing Vendor SOC Reports, Reviewing Findings and Next Steps. As a reminder, you can refer to the full life cycle that is below the slides area on your screen to understand where this fits into the process. We are joined again by VendMinder's Lisa Mayhill, Information Security Operation Director. Lisa, take it away.
Okay, hopefully you guys aren't sick of the sound of my voice yet. In this session, we're going to talk about SOC reports, right? So what a vendor SOC report is, how to assess a vendor SOC report, reviewing auditor opinions and findings, and what to do if your vendor has an unfavorable SOC report. All right. Let's jump right in. So what is a SOC report at its most basic level? A SOC report is a document. It's designed to provide information to your organization or to the user entity on three primary components. The controls that a vendor has in place to protect their system, any controls that your organization needs to implement to assist the vendor in accomplishing those controls, and then independent testing of those stated controls, providing some level of assurance that the control environment is as presented. A SOC report is a very standard third-party risk management document. I'm sure the majority of you have seen them and worked with them, but we're going to kind of go through them now. So when we're talking about SOC reports as part of regular vendor management, third-party risk management, you really want to consider them at several different points in that life cycle. Of course, at onboarding, when you're onboarding new vendors, if they have a SOC, you should be reviewing it. If they have any new services or products or that you're going to start using, then you want to review the SOC report for that new service or product, even if you've already reviewed that vendor for a different product or service, because there could be new information. Definitely annually, or at least ongoing, SOC reports should be reviewed, generally speaking, on an annual basis. And then situationally, when there are exceptions or issues that require a more immediate re-review, so maybe they didn't do so great on the first quarter SOC report that they provided, so maybe you want to look at quarters 2 or 3. If they only do them annually, you might just have to do some follow-up on any findings. And then, of course, as new reports are available. Some vendors produce new SOC reports in additional points throughout the year, and so you want to make sure that you're reviewing the most current. This slide can actually go for either of the last 2 sessions as well. So who should review SOC reports? This is the same kind of thing of who should review cybersecurity documentation, who should review business continuity and disaster recovery documentation. There's a lot of roles that can take on this responsibility. The importance should be on expertise and qualifications. This is true for all 3 of these sessions and the topics that we've talked about so far. There are some certifications that can offer a certain level of understanding in the field, things like the CISA, the CISSP, the CRISC, the CTPRP. These types of certifications, they allow a certain level of confidence that there is a knowledge base surrounding information security, which is truly what you're looking at when you're looking through SOC reports, cybersecurity documentation, and business continuity and disaster recovery. ABCP is another one that's more specific to business continuity. We encourage those types of certifications for people or knowledge bases for people reviewing SOCs because assessing SOC reports can help you identify gaps in security, right? You can compare against a baseline of what you would expect to see and use that as a benchmark for consistency. But you have to have a certain level of knowledge base to do that. Evaluating exceptions and the auditor's opinion will allow for quick, high-level insight into issues. Just because an auditor's opinion is unqualified, which is great, it doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions. Those exceptions still need to be looked at to understand impact. A SOC assessment, especially SOC 2s, can help you establish your threshold for controls. So it's not enough just to have an unqualified report. You want to understand what's in it to then determine if that works for you. So you have to assess that SOC report. And this allows for a consistent review of your vendors across industries and products, right? Because we know that SOC reports can be done by any number of different CPA firms, auditors. So if you have a standardized assessment, then you're always looking for those same things, which helps you have that consistency and baselines. So there are a handful of different kinds of SOC reports. Our SOC webinar gets really more in depth into each of these different types and when you would see them. For the purposes of this boot camp, I'm just going to do a quick brief overview. SOC 1s and SOC 2s are going to be the SOCs that you primarily see. A SOC 1 is designed to review an organization's internal controls as they relate to financial reporting. And a SOC 2 examines the organization's controls over one or more of 5 trust service criteria. So it's a little bit more scoped. A SOC 2 Plus pairs that trust service criteria with another well-known framework. A SOC 3 is really a summary of a SOC 2. And a SOC for cybersecurity is relatively new. I mean, it's been around for a while, but we don't see a lot of people taking advantage of them. But they describe the organization's cybersecurity risk management program in detail. Again, a SOC 1 and 2 is what you'll primarily see, and that's really what we'll focus on for today. So as we get ready to talk about how to review a vendor SOC report, really understanding the anatomy is important. And so typically there's 5 sections, with section 5 being optional. So the first 4 sections are going to be in every SOC report that you see. Section 1 is the auditor's report. Section 2 is going to be the organization's management assertion. Section 3 is the description of the system. This is the meatiest part of the report, typically, the narrative. And then Section 4 is the actual layout of the control objectives and activities and any testing that took place. And then Section 5 is optional. It's going to be unaudited information. And so sometimes they'll have it, sometimes they won't, but it's kind of an optional section. And I think we're going to roll into our next poll question.
This brings us to our first poll question after the break. And this poll question is, what is most valuable to you in a SOC report when performing due diligence? The auditor's opinion, exceptions in validating the controls, complementary user entity controls, a combination, or you're not sure? Lisa, while we wait for these results to come in, let's answer another question. And this question is, should we always ask for a SOC 2? If they don't have one, when should that be a red flag?
So my rule of thumb for SOC reviews of your vendors is basically if they have a SOC, review it. And if they have a SOC 1 and a SOC 2 and you have to choose, always go with the SOC 2. That being said, there are a lot of reasons a vendor may not have a SOC at all. A SOC audit is extremely expensive. A SOC 2 audit can be even more expensive depending on the number of trust service criteria they opt to be audited on. So based on cost alone, it's not uncommon for small or less mature vendors to not have one. If they don't have one, though, they should still be able to provide evidence of regular self-audits, so proper documentation, et cetera. So really size doesn't matter when it comes to information security and having due diligence or evidence of due diligence. The small, less mature vendor should still have the same basic controls in place and be able to demonstrate that. And I would also say it's more of a red flag if they have a SOC but don't want to share it, or if they've had a SOC performed once and then not again. You have to figure out why a vendor who went through the financial commitment and rigorous process of a SOC audit would then not want to share it with you, especially when the intent of a SOC report is to share it with clients to validate that they have strong controls in place. So really, to me, the bigger red flag is when they do have them but don't share them.
Okay, everyone, here are those results. Thank you for submitting your responses. Before we move on, please be aware that in the related content widget, you'll find our What to Do if your vendor has a negative SOC report infographic available for download. This resource walks you through next steps after you have received an unfavorable vendor SOC report. Lisa, back to you.
So when you're ready to sit down and look at a vendor SOC report, it's good to have a roadmap for yourself. And this is the roadmap that we recommend. So first, SOC timeframe, then independent service auditor's report, review the management's assertion, the description of the system and controls, the control objectives, activities, and tests, and then any other information. So ultimately, you follow the setup of the report, right? You follow that anatomy, sections 1 through 5, and then we'll give you some key points to look through at each section. So the first piece really is SOC timeframe, right? You have to understand what you're looking at. So there's two types of SOC reports outside of a SOC 1 and 2. There's a type 1 and a type 2. A type 1 report covers a point in time. Type 1 reports typically just demonstrate that a control exists, that it's in place. Type 1 reports are assessed for being in place in that moment in time that the report takes place. Type 1 reports can be considered a little less mature, and that's just because a Type 2 report is going to cover a period of time, typically 6 to 12 months. Type 2 reports demonstrate that a control is actually functioning. So Type 2 reports are assessed for operating effectively, making sure that controls are actually operating over that period of time. And that's why they're considered a little bit more of a mature environment when you see a Type 2 report. So sometimes you'll see a bridge gap letter with a SOC report, and ultimately what it is it's a statement from the vendor or the service organization that as of the date of the letter, there have not been any changes in that SOC report up until that letter date. This is not a replacement for a SOC report. So if you expect to see another SOC report and they give you a bridge gap letter instead of the next covered period, then you want to ask some questions about that. You won't see bridge letters all the time. They're not required, but it is a step of good faith, so you can always request them. So when we talk about the first section, the auditor's report, this is really a summary of the SOC, right? A summary of the engagement. In here, you would expect to see the auditor's opinion, which is going to be the overall findings from the auditor themselves. So there's 4 types of opinions: unqualified, qualified, disclaimer, and adverse. Unqualified is what you want to see. Sometimes people think that sounds bad, but unqualified is the best news you can get. And generally speaking, if a report is unqualified, you're not going to see them say unqualified. It's just not going to have one of these other 3 opinions. The auditor's letter will state that all control objectives met the requirements. A qualified opinion is where the vendor had at least one control objective that was not implemented or operating effectively. So you're going to want to make a note of a qualified opinion and follow up on that. And then a disclaimer is used when there isn't any evidence to prove or disprove that a control wasn't being performed or in place. So this is, again, you want to kind of make a note of that as well, because you may want to follow up on that if the control is something that's important to your use of the product or service. And then an adverse opinion is bad. It's a red flag. Definitely want to follow up on that, because that means that the vendor held back or modified information that was needed to verify controls. So definitely something to follow up on. The management assertion letter, section 2, is going to basically describe the service organization system to help the auditor perform the upcoming audit with certain assumptions in mind. It will also call out if there were any major changes in their organization or the product or service during the period. Sometimes you'll see that they changed data center locations or they changed their name. Those kinds of things would be in section 2, the management's assertion. So section 3 is the narrative of the report. In most circumstances, this is the meatiest part of the report. You're going to find areas like the organization and administration, some things that you want to look for here is, who's the vendor? What about them? Do they have executive and senior management structure? Are they providing security training and policy acknowledgments? Who are their subservice organizations? That's a very important piece. And then the products and services that are covered under the report. This is so important. You want to make sure that your vendor has given you the right report. Vendors have tons of SOC reports nowadays for different types of products and services, so you want to make sure you're looking at the right one. The system description section will detail the services and products provided. And like I said, many vendors separate out products into different reports, so you want to make sure that you're looking at the product or service that you use and that that report covers it correctly. This narrative section should also include controls surrounding the information systems, the data center, and then complementary user entity controls. So when we talk about the information system, what we're looking for in a SOC is really an understanding of what type of information your vendor processes and how they protect it. So we're looking for things regarding the infrastructure. So server security, network security, access management, vulnerability management. And then when we talk about data centers, what we want to understand is the access controls, the environment, and the monitoring of this infrastructure, where data is stored, where it's processed through. So we're looking for physical access controls, environmental controls, monitoring controls. This is all stuff you should find in this section. And then complementary user entity controls. These are controls that the vendor relies on you, the user entity, to implement in order to achieve their control objectives. You really want to make sure that you understand what the complementary user entity controls are, and they can generally be found in this narrative section. Subservice organizations are another key piece of information to extract from this narrative section of the SOC report. A subservice organization is really a vendor that your vendor uses, so your fourth party, and they perform a critical part of the product or service that is being delivered or reviewed in that SOC report. So you want to understand what those subservice organizations are, because you may also need to review them as a fourth party. So you will see subservice organizations represented either inclusively, meaning that the auditor will test the controls that they're responsible for, or carved out, which means that they will be out of scope of the SOC report. Most times you'll see it as carved out. The report should clarify exactly how subservice organizations are used and should include the specific controls that they're responsible for. Okay, so now let's get into the control objectives, activities, and the tests of controls. Within this section, you're going to find the control objectives, the controls and tests, any exceptions that are found, and then in rare cases, significant deficiencies and material weaknesses. SOC reports are built around the vendor's control objectives. These are the overall goals for a function. And then control activities support those objectives. Auditors create tests for those activities where they might review or observe or interview, all to determine whether the control is in place for a Type 1 report, and for Type 2s, whether they're operating effectively. If that testing doesn't go well, or if there's nothing to test, then exceptions, and again, rarely, significant deficiencies and material weaknesses will come into play. You don't really want to see any of these, but it's very common to have exceptions, and understanding exceptions and the impact to you is critical, because an exception may not be that big of a deal to you, or an exception that may appear not to be a big deal might be a big deal to you. So you want to make sure that you're able to risk rate those exceptions and see the impact to you and your organization. So when we talk about the impact, what we're really saying is, what was the opinion of the report, and then what do those exceptions mean to me, right? So when we look at exceptions, we also want to consider the management's response, and then if there were any mitigating or compensating controls in place that would lessen any impact of that exception. And that's why we say that understanding the impact of the opinion and the exceptions is really key to when you're reviewing a SOC report, because exceptions can range from a variety of different controls. So just a quick note here on control design. I just want to bring forward that not all SOC reports are created equally. Vendors write the control activities that they're audited against, right? So they're the ones that set up exactly what the audit is going to look like. And then the CPA firm, they come in and do the testing. But the controls are determined by the vendor. So SOC 2s are better about this because they have to follow the trust service criteria, so there's at least some guidelines. But control complexity can vary greatly between vendors and between controls. So it's just something to be aware of. Okay, so the next thing I want to touch on is complementary user entity controls. These are controls that the vendor has included within its system in which they feel like you, the user entity, must implement to ensure that their control objectives are accomplished. These are different than user responsibilities or recommendations or other non-required complementary controls. They're saying that these are required for the product or service to function. Just really quick, 3 reasons that, I think you should always be reviewing the QE section. 1, it's essentially a control guide that will provide you exactly what you need to do to protect your organization while using this product or service. If controls are missed or not reviewed, this could have a negative impact on your organization because the vendor's product or service won't be as secure. And if not properly reviewed and implemented, then there's increased risk to your organization, but also regulators are looking for you to complete them. So you want to make sure that you have evidence of that. Okay, so everybody always says, okay, I've reviewed the SOC report, it doesn't look good. So what do I do now? What am I supposed to do with this information? Ideally, everything would look great on a SOC report. There's no red flags to investigate, no recommendations. But if there are issues, then you need to address them. So the first thing that I would recommend is that you review your vendor's response. Some reports will have responses baked right into them, right? The vendor will have a management's response to any exceptions, and they'll usually include any mitigating controls that may be in place or extenuating circumstances, and this can usually be found in section 4 or 5 of the report. And then request clarification from the vendor. It's absolutely appropriate for you to reach out to the vendor and say, hey, this doesn't sit right, can you provide some additional documentation? Maybe they have something that they've already produced that will help you to answer your questions. You can also consider implementing more robust monitoring. Some issues can be addressed by more frequent review schedule. Continuous monitoring is imperative for any vendor, but some vendors might require a little bit more attention, especially if you're seeing negative results in their SOC reports. And then finally, you have to consider at some points modifying or terminating the contract. When reviewing a SOC report from an existing vendor, you're going to need to determine how to address issues within the confines of your contract. So depending on the severity of the SOC issue and your organization's risk tolerance, you might want to consider modifying the vendor contract. Okay, so that was a ton of information in a really short period of time, so I'm just going to try to wrap it all up with a handful of key takeaways. First, you want to evaluate those fourth-party relationships in the report, right? So understand the subservices and how they operate within that service or product. And then assess the risk and impact of any exceptions. You want to make sure that you understand if the exception has impact to you. Of course, read and understand the report, right? You want to make sure you have the right people looking at it so that they can really understand the context of everything that's in there, including the ability to look for gaps and areas of ambiguity. Sometimes the biggest red flags are the things that are missing. You want to make sure that you document and address any areas of ambiguity or issue or those red flags. And look for those complementary user entity controls. And also want to make sure you address them appropriately. And then, of course, the best way to do all of these things is to make sure that you have the right people looking at the report and that you're really utilizing people with expertise. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I will pass it back.
Thank you, Lisa, for another great session. Now, Hillary Dewhurst, VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, will discuss managing AI risk with third-party risk management. Once again, please be sure to refer to the full life cycle below the slides area on your screen if you'd like a visual of where this fits into the process. Hillary, the floor is yours.
All right, well, we're going to cover a lot in a pretty short time today, but we're going to start with AI and the risks that are specific to this technology. We're going to talk about how to identify vendor AI risks and how to update your third-party risk management framework to include those risks. So let's jump right in. All right, so it's important to start off with what artificial intelligence actually is. So we call it artificial intelligence or AI, but this is a branch of computer science that's been developed to create systems and machines that can perform tasks that previously required human intelligence. And AI is distinctly different from automation because automation works on a set of predetermined rules, whereas AI actually learns from data and continuously adapts from those learnings. Okay, so there are basically two types of AI. Just real quickly, there's what we call narrow or weak AI and general or strong AI. Now, with narrow, it doesn't mean it's weak, like it's not a powerful system. It just merely refers to the fact that AI in this context is very constrained. It's really meant to address or perform a single function, right? Whereas general or strong AI is a broad type of AI that can learn and adapt across multiple tasks, multiple domains. And this would be more similar to what we can do with our human brain. Right now, general AI is really much more of a concept as there's no real examples of it existing today. Now, when it comes to concepts and terms that you might need to know, things you might hear, let's start with machine learning. So this is the technique that's used to build and train AI models. And so you've got to understand with AI, we're not programming this data. What we're doing is taking existing data and we're asking the AI to go in and analyze it, identify trends, and start making predictions based on those trends. You have deep learning, which is a subset of machine learning, which goes deeper, which may look at different levels of data, different data sets to draw those same conclusions. We have what's artificial neural networks, which are really inspired by the human brain. And these systems can learn and enhance their performance over time because they can identify these patterns and make informed decisions based on those patterns. We also have natural language processing, and this is the AI that teaches systems to understand and interpret and even generate human language. So this is very much what we would see in those home systems like Siri or Alexa. We have computer vision that focuses on letting the AI interpret and understand visual data. So this is used in things like facial recognition systems and self-driving cars and all those fun image editing apps we all use. Then there's generative AI, and this is very common because of systems like ChatGPT. It responds to a prompt and generates text, image, voices, or other media, and it uses those neural networks to identify patterns, structure, etc., within existing data to generate new content. And AI is not just something somewhere down the future. It's already here. We're using it every day in both our personal and professional lives. So if you think about your smartphone that can open when it recognizes your face, or your Siri, which can turn your lights on or off, even the navigation apps like Google Maps and Waze use AI. We also have all our social media algorithms and our language like Google Translate and language learning apps like Duolingo, all the creativity stuff that we can do with it, and even health and wellness. Those alerts in your little smartwatch are all based on AI. In business, we're using it for fraud detection, customer service. You know, how many times do you get a little chat bot that comes up to answer your questions? But they're using it in things like claims handling to analyze documents and verify those claims, underwriting and processing. So looking at broad sets of data to really get to what the right underwriting formula is. Also, very popular in market analysis and trading, because these trades can be executed and analyzed much faster than they can be with a human perspective. We use them in security, inventory management, and logistics and transportation. So with all this amazing technology, we've got to understand that AI does present some substantial risks. One of the biggest problems with AI is it's still relatively new. It's still developing, and we don't yet understand all the potential negative impacts that might arise through its use. But two that we really want to focus on when it comes to third-party risk management are around data security and privacy and compliance risk. So not only regulatory compliance, but how the models are trained and if they're auditable. All right, well, speaking of compliance, let's think about the current legal and regulatory environments that are dealing with AI today. So first of all, we have President Biden's order on AI from last year, and it's really seeking to address the safety, security, privacy, all the civil rights, et cetera, in the federal use of AI. We have multiple states that are crafting or developing their own AI laws, especially around data privacy, accountability, and fairness, and states like California that actually limit the use of tools like facial recognition by law enforcement, making sure that it's not the sole basis for an arrest. Now, as is the case with a lot of emerging risk issues, we see the EU really taking the lead here. They just adopted the AI Act, which is very clearly defines what an AI system is setting some very strong transparency and accountability requirements, and will do things like make it, you have to call out a deepfake or AI-generated content, or let someone know that they're talking to a chatbot. But it also specifically prohibits certain types of AI, such as emotion recognition software in workplaces or schools, or predictive policing. It also is generally prohibitive of any AI that is going to manipulate human behavior or exploit people's vulnerabilities. It's also important to know that this act has what we call extraterritorial effect, which means even if your organization is in the U.S., if you're deploying products or services that involve AI to European customers, the AI Act still applies. So with that, let's go to our first poll. Jessie?
The next poll question is, my organization has established requirements and processes to identify, assess, manage, and monitor AI risk in vendor-provided products and services. Yes, it's in progress, no, or not sure. Hillary, we have another question here from the audience.
Okay, great.
Can you explain why we would need to treat AI differently than any other technology product or service we may use?
That is a really good question. So first of all, it's important to recognize that, yes, AI is a technology product, and it has a lot of the same attributes as other technology products, like cybersecurity risk and operational risk. But what's unique to AI, and that we have to really be aware of, is that there are risks that are not only more unique and unusual risks for third-party risk management programs, but they're new risks for technology professionals to be dealing with as well, such as ethical risk, right? If the model has been trained correctly, what data has it been trained on? How do we know that that output is reliable? Those are things that we don't always consider with other technology products, although there's certainly elements of that. What the data is doing is part of testing and things like that. But AI is unique because it's kind of crossing into these risks that we really haven't had to systematically address before. So that is why we need to treat it differently than just any other technology product. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our 6 vendor risk categories and common red flags infographic available for download in the related content widget. Back to you, Hillary.
All right, so when it comes to the third-party risks associated with AI, some of them are going to feel familiar. We have data security or cybersecurity risk because AI systems need a lot of data to work. And it's also important to remember that they are, just like any other digital system, susceptible to attack. Unfortunately, some of the attack techniques that are being focused on AI are meant to actually manipulate the data that's driving the AI to cause negative outcomes or really harmful results, or to leak data. Of course, we have compliance related to how all data is used, if that's permissible, all the privacy laws, rules, and regulations of all these different jurisdictions. We have operational risk, which can increase if we rely too much on AI systems, especially if that means that employees' critical decision-making or ability to think through decisions during a business interruption are hindered because there's an over-reliance on that technology. We also have reputation and brand issues, which if anyone's ever been online with a terrible chatbot that's not answering your question or sending you the wrong place, it tends to make you feel a lot less confident about the company you're working with, or even angry and frustrated. Also, when we have too much reliance on AI, it really takes away that human factor, which can result in all kinds of negative things like lower issue resolution rates and distrust in your organization. So on top of those more well-known risks, we have some risks that feel new or unique, and they are specific to AI. One of those is what we call explicability and transparency risk, which means with these very complicated models and all this data, sometimes it's hard to understand exactly how the AI is making its decision. That can be a problem if you're in a regulated industry where all your decisions have to be auditable. There's all kinds of intellectual property risks, from reviewing trade secrets and confidential information, but also determining who owns the final product. You know, if it's an AI-generated image, who owns that image, and violation of copyright agreements and licensing. These last two I do want to focus on because they're very unique to AI. One is bias and fairness, and that means that AI systems can inadvertently amplify bias if they're trained on bad data. So that means decisions about everything from hiring to loan approvals can really mess up and unjustly disadvantage certain groups. And this can cause all kinds of legal issues and reputational issues. Moreover, there's a bigger question about moral and ethical concerns, whether or not the benefit of the AI is actually driving the right ethical outcome. So some examples would be we over-automate and we lead to a lot of job loss, or self-driving cars choosing between the safety of the passenger or a pedestrian. There's all kinds of racial, gender, and socioeconomic biases that can be perpetuated and harm marginalized groups. So those are just some of the few risks we have to think about. So now that I've got you more aware about all the risks that are lurking in AI, it's probably a good time to tell you that you already have products or services that you get from your vendors that are probably using AI technology. And there's also probably a good chance that your third-party risk program has not done the work yet to formally identify those risks. We don't want you to feel bad about this because it's new for everyone and it's moving at such a lightning speed. But just because everyone's not there yet doesn't mean that we shouldn't all act with urgency to start identifying, assessing, and mitigating those AI risks. Now, assuming that your program has not done anything yet, the very first thing we would recommend is that you develop a very short questionnaire to share with your vendors. And we are suggesting 3 questions can really help you get a handle on AI in your vendor inventory. So the first question is, Is AI technology an existing component of, or has it been used to research, develop, or produce any of your products or services? If yes, they need to give you some details. Are there plans to incorporate AI in your products or services in the future? If yes, how so? And then most importantly, do you have any policies on employee use of AI? We do want to know this because if they're allowing their employees to use things like ChatGPT, how are they controlling that? What is going on in that situation? Always start with your critical and high-risk vendors and work your way down the list. So sending out that brief questionnaire can really help you identify where you might have those risks. But unfortunately, that's enough because this is an evolving risk domain. And so we need to really make sure that our third-party risk management frameworks are updated and adjusted to incorporate that AI risk. So we have to make sure that we have AI questions in our inherent risk assessment, and we have to update our vendor questionnaires. We also need to think about what types of due diligence documentation or other information we might request as evidence of AI controls. And here's the big one. Who is the appropriate subject matter expert in your organization to review those controls? We also want to think about how this is going to affect our standard contract language, how we want to use that to further mitigate controls and call out specific requirements around AI. We also want to think about how we might factor that into performance monitoring and management, and how we're going to factor it into risk monitoring. We also may need to update our governance documentation to specifically address those risks. And on top of it, we need to educate and collaborate with all of our stakeholders. All right, with all this new risk comes new challenges, especially when putting your program together. Here's 3 you need to watch out for. One is if your internal stakeholders and product managers, vendor managers, whatever, do not have good knowledge about how the AI in the product or service was built or what it entails or how it operates, you might see some inaccurate inherent risk assessments. You also need to consider that vendors providing products and services with AI features may not have the best vendor risk management processes, or they're not addressing those risks in their contracts. That means that AI risk could be amplified for your organization. And the last one here is that during due diligence, that effective review of AI controls requires access to subject matter expertise that may not be available in your organization. And as I mentioned before, your current contracts, your existing templated language is probably not addressing this. So that's something that we need to really focus every single time we do a contract for an AI product or service. But the last one here is that because all these models can learn from bad data, we need to think about how this is going to impact our performance monitoring and risk reviewing. Maybe it's more in-depth, it's more frequent, but it will impact how often and how deep we look at how those products and services are performing. So another really important thing I want to highlight is your subject matter experts. AI crosses a lot of risk domains, that's cybersecurity, compliance, finance, etc. But we do need now additional expertise to really help us identify the questions we're going to ask in the inherent risk questionnaire. What do we need to now include in the vendor risk questionnaire? What types of documents or information are we going to accept or review as part of due diligence? And we need someone to actually perform those risk and control assessments and validate any issue remediation related to that AI has taken place. And then just be a general consultant for the program as it relates to AI identification, assessment, monitoring, management, and governance. All right, when it comes to subject matter expertise, as a rule, we know that subject matter experts should be qualified. That means they have both good practical experience and are professionally certified or have credentials for the risk domain that they're reviewing. Because AI is very new, there's actually not a lot of well-established credentials. So what are we looking for in an SME that's going to help us review these control assessments and help us do those other tasks I mentioned on the previous slide. What we're looking for is somebody that has a strong background and experience with data science, and preferably hold data science credentials or certifications such as a CDSP or an open CDS. Those are essential. Data science is essential for evaluating and reviewing controls related to AI model risk in particular. Now, as I mentioned, contracts are another huge consideration here. So what do we need to be asking about? What do we need to talk to our legal teams about when updating this information? So first of all, we need a good definition of AI in those contracts. We need language around performance and accuracy, and good language around data security and privacy. This is pretty typical anytime we have data, but we may need to do extra work for these AI contracts. We also want to make sure that we have language around that explainability and transparency, making the requirements about, having auditable data, how to audit those decisions, treatment of intellectual property, ethical use and bias mitigation, and this could take a lot of extra work with the help of that data scientist and your compliance team in particular. And then always for AI, you have to make sure that you have a right to audit so that you can really get into that vendor's processes, how they handle the data, and all the compliance with contractual terms. All right, I think we're ready for our last poll of this session. Jessie?
We are at our last poll question of the day, and this question is, my organization is actively pursuing AI solutions for our employees and or customers. Yes, no, or not sure? Hillary, we have another question here that we can answer.
All right, I'm ready.
Great. And that question is, we have a vendor who is incorporating AI into their logistics service but cannot provide a separate AI governance policy. Would you consider that a big concern?
It would depend on a few things. Now, the first thing is they may not have a policy yet because they're still doing all the work that a lot of us are doing and figuring it out. I would look at other elements in that due diligence search to really understand if they understand the implications of AI. Do they identify the proper risk? Do they have the right controls in place to monitor it? As for the actual policy, the other question would be, are they working on it? Can they provide it within a reasonable amount of time, or is that something you can write into the contract? If it seems that the reason there's no policy is because there's just no understanding of those risks involved in AI, then yes, I would consider it a big problem. If it's something they're working on and they're just not there yet, probably not as big of an issue. I hope that gives you some direction.
And on your screen now, you can see the results for that final poll question. Thank you everyone for answering this question. Before moving on, please be aware that our Artificial Intelligence Sample Vendor Questionnaire is available for download in the Related Content widget. This vendor risk questionnaire helps your organization obtain information on how AI is used and better understand the vendor's risk practices and controls. I'll pass it back to you, Hillary.
So obviously, the implications of AI risk do go beyond just third-party risk management framework concerns. So I really recommend that you get with your risk committee, or if you're lucky enough to have one, your designated AI risk management team, and really start talking about who those internal AI subject matter experts are and what is our organization's governance structure around AI. So how would our internal standards compare to what we might ask of a vendor? And then what position do we have on our employees using web-enabled AI tools like ChatGPT and other tools which might sidestep third-party risk management, right? Because we need to make sure that everything that we're using that has AI gets evaluated by third-party risk management. We also need to know what plans there are for any employee education, because ultimately, the more people know, the better we can manage risk. And then how can we all work together to leverage these resources, which are probably not that plentiful, and improve risk management overall. All right, just to wrap up our brief session on AI today, the first thing we can tell you is get educated about AI and pay attention to those regulations. That EU AI Act is going to influence a lot of what happens in the U.S. over the next few years. Go ahead and start identifying where that AI risk exists in your vendor inventory. And in the meantime, you do need to start planning to update your framework. This is going to probably give you some challenges. Don't be surprised by that. You just need to power through, and hopefully you can do that by getting access to a good qualified SME who has that data science skill. Also, work with legal to get those contract templates, standards, and terms updated to address AI, and get with your risk committee, because actually this is an issue that everybody will have better risk outcomes, not just third-party risk management, if you work together. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie.
Thank you so much, Hillary, for that session. Before we move on to more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending our second day of boot camp. I would also like to thank our experts from today, Lisa and Hillary, for their time in sharing some important information on cybersecurity posture, business continuity and disaster recovery, SOC reports, and AI risk. Tomorrow, on the third and final day of the boot camp, we'll be joined around the campfire by Raman Zachariah, VinMinder's Chief Financial Officer. He'll discuss financial health in today's business climate. Then Christine Kitamura, VinMinder's Senior Content Manager of Education, will discuss regulatory requirements and expectations in third-party risk management. After a quick break, Hillary Dewhurst, VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, will join us to wrap up our boot camp with top third-party risk management program metrics and reports and understanding vendor exit strategies, as well as third-party risk management closure. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Lisa, this next question will come to you. Is a review of a vendor SIG good enough to ensure they have a solid CSA program in place?
Thank you. So that's a great question. I think we see the SIG a lot. It's an excellent questionnaire. It's the standard information gathering questionnaire. I think the thing about a SIG that we have to keep in mind when we're using it as evidence is that it's only as good as the person filling it out, right? The questionnaire is awesome because a lot of vendors are willing to fill them out. I just don't know that I would stop at a SIG if this was a critical vendor. Ultimately, you want to see documentation to validate, right? If it's all they'll give you, it's all they'll give you. It's a great start. It obviously has a ton of questions on it. It's got the right questions on it. It's not the only thing I would ask for unless it's the only thing you have time to review. It really just depends on a bunch of variables. I think in today's TPRM environment where we know it's hard to get stuff from vendors, it is an excellent place to start.
Great. And Lisa, this next question will come to you as well. Can I use a SOC 2 to assess a vendor's cyber program, or does it have to be a SOC for cyber?
That's a great question too. If a vendor has a SOC for cyber, definitely take that over a SOC 2. We just don't see them very often right now. They've been around for a while, but not a lot of vendors are utilizing them. So a SOC 2 is just going to be more common. SOC 2s can answer a lot of questions about a cybersecurity program if they're done fully and correctly. But again, when we're talking about these kind of documents, the vendor is the one who's picking and choosing what they're going to answer in them. So I still feel pretty strongly that policy and procedure documentation to validate audits and third-party reviews is just so important. But if they have a SOC for cybersecurity, definitely take it. It's geared towards their cybersecurity program. It's going to be really honing in on it. But you don't have to not accept anything else. Like a SOC 2 is great as well.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Hillary, this next question will come to you.
Okay.
I heard that spam filtering is a type of AI. Does that mean we have to do extra AI due diligence for our email provider? We use Microsoft.
Oh, that's a great question. And yes, technically spam filtering is a type of AI, but it really works more on automation and predetermined rules. So I wouldn't get too wrapped up about extra due diligence for Microsoft. The chances are that your organization is probably not doing a lot of due diligence on Microsoft Office or its tools in general, just because they're one of those organizations that isn't going to give you a lot. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it in that instance. I hope that helps.
Great. And Lisa, we will come back to you for this next question. Should a vendor have a specific pandemic plan in place, or is it okay if they just include a statement in their overall BCP?
So it's interesting because I feel like after COVID, pandemic planning became a huge deal, right? Like everybody was reviewing business continuity, looking for pandemic planning. Is my vendor doing the right thing? Were they ready? And a lot of times we found that they weren't, right? Pandemic planning was always just a sentence in the policy. But vendors have gotten better, right? They've gotten way more robust. We realize now that a pandemic is a very specific type of disruption, right? We know that it's a big deal. It's not like this sci-fi movie that could happen. It actually does happen. So I think it's important to see a solid pandemic plan as part of the business continuity and disaster recovery planning. Do they need a whole separate plan? Probably not. I think the move to remote work is a big part of what people do in a pandemic scenario or in a crisis. So I think you want to see more than a sentence. You want to make sure that they do actually have a plan in place for a loss of workforce, right? Because that's what we're talking about when we say pandemic planning. We're really talking about a mass loss of your employees all at once. What are you going to do with that? So more than a sentence doesn't necessarily have to be a whole individual plan. And it also matters, of course, the criticality of the vendor, what they do for you. So, again, there's variables, but I would say you need a little bit more than a sentence at this point.
Great. And Hillary, back over to you for this next question.
Okay.
Does the FTC regulate AI?
That is a great question. Not directly. So here's what you need to understand. The FTC, when it comes to AI, where their focus has been, is really about people making false claims about what their AI products can do. There's been quite a few over the past few years where, a company will come out and say, you can do this, 1,000 times faster. And they're just making a lot of claims around AI. They're also claiming that there's AI in products where it doesn't actually exist. And in those cases, the FTC would come down pretty false advertising, right? That's what the FTC has a strong focus on. From a regulatory perspective, there's not anyone specifically that's, in charge of AI yet. There's a lot of work being done in that space. And I would actually say I anticipate something happening sooner than later where there'll be more specific inclusions in existing guidance, like the interagency guidance or some of these others that do touch on AI, but not the FTC today. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Lisa and Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you will find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics such as cybersecurity, business continuity and disaster recovery, SOC reports, AI risk, and more. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive Friday afternoon. Also in the email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credits. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found day 2 of the bootcamp valuable. I'd also like to give another big thank you to Hillary and Lisa for their time and content. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you, and we will see you tomorrow for our 3rd and final day of the bootcamp.